Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. Nepal Conversations is a podcast series where we talk to scholars and researchers about the interesting work on various aspects of Nepali society. We're very pleased to present Series 4 of Nepal Conversations podcast on the theme of erasures. This series is presented jointly by International Research Project Heritage as Placemaking and Nepal Conversations. You can find this series on Nepal Conversation channel on YouTube, Spotify and SoundCloud, as well as on Heritage as Placemaking website. In this second episode of the series, we are pleased to present our conversation with Mr. Roshan Mishra. Roshan Mishra is the Director of Taragaon Museum and a Kathmandu-based visual artist. He oversees the Nepal Architecture Archive, which is run by the Saraf Foundation for Himalayan Traditions and Culture, a Taragaon Museum patron organization. Roshan is also the founder of the Global Nepali Museum, Nepalian Art, and an initiator of the Mishra Museum, as well as a visiting faculty member at Kathmandu University, Art and Design. Roshan has been actively involved in the Nepali Heritage Recovery campaign, NHRC, a groundbreaking initiative to bring back Nepali lost and stolen heritage. Today, we will discuss the concepts, practicalities, and difficulties of bringing forward restitution cases, negotiating repatriation, and exploring restorative justice. Namaste Roshanji and welcome to Nepal Conversations and the series on erasure which is being produced in collaboration with the research project Heritage as Placemaking. Roshanji, you've been actively involved in the Nepal Heritage Recovery campaign, NHRC, to bring back Nepali lost and stolen heritage. We want to learn a little bit more about your work. So can you explain how the NHRC, the Nepal Heritage Recovery Campaign, was established and how you became part of it? And we understand that there is a Facebook group called Lost Arts of Nepal. What role does this Facebook group play in this context?
So I think with the Nepal Heritage Recovery Campaign, initially it was just an idea. It was an idea just floated among few of us. And then it was around 2020 when we started talking about Dilendra Shrestha and Sanjay Adhikari. And then we thought that in Nepal's context, it is very difficult to work without an organization, especially, especially like in Nepal, without a non-profit organization. If we want to work as a group, it was very difficult to do so. So that was one of the reasons we actually registered the Nepal Heritage Recovery Campaign and started that as a formal campaign. And my involvement was, I think, just before the recovery campaign got started. It was around 2019 when I started my own project called Global Nepali Museum. And that platform was a platform for everyone who wanted to see the Nepali objects from different museums around the world. And I think that particular project kind of pushed me to this repatriation campaign, and it was like we always, different individuals working in different institutions or working very, very differently, but there was something common, very common within all of us. And that is one of the reasons I think that group was formed, and that's how I became a part of it. And when you talk about Lost Arts of Nepal, it's known as a anonymous Facebook page run by an individual. But when we started the campaign, we were in touch with the Lost Arts of Nepal, and that person was willing to be a part of Nepal Heritage Recovery Campaign as an advisor. So it was, it was a very supportive initiation that came from Lost Arts of Nepal. And for us, it was, the research part was the most important thing. And then in terms of Lost Arts of Nepal, everything, that part was totally covered by Lost Arts of Nepal. So that's how they got involved in the project as well.
Thank you. We understand that the establishing of provenance is key in repatriation claims when the legal title of objects needs to be established and transferred. Let's look at the difference between urgent interventions by the campaign to prevent the selling of objects versus the establishment of a claim against a national museum in the West. So my first question here is, what happens when you're alerted to an urgent case? For example, when you identify a statue that's likely of Nepali origin in an auction at Bonhams, Christie's or Sotheby's, what are the steps to be taken to prevent the object being auctioned off and disappearing into private hands? How does
Yeah.
such a case then differ from the repatriation claims established, for example, in prominent museums in France?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. I think it's when you look at such urgent cases, uh, in those sort of cases, we'll have very limited time to kind of action or do things that are required. And like when the matching is done by Lost Arts of Nepal, for example, um, there was 5 objects that was found in Bonhams, which was being auctioned from auction, and that was a part of a Mulchok Toran from Patton, right? And it was a very difficult situation for us to gather information. And it's not matching is one important factor, but there's so many other factors that are required to be addressed if we really want to stop that auction, or if we want to withdraw that particular object from the auction. And one of the important part is FIR. If we don't have the FIR, then it's very likely that the auction houses will not actually react to our voices. For example, like this Bonham's case I was mentioning, that particular auction was stopped within 24 hours, and that is because of various different reasons. We had plenty of photographs that was from the sites before and after. There was an article that was written in the Nepali Times just that day when that object was found in the auction house, and they were getting lots of push from the social media as well. So eventually, within 24 hours, Bonhams actually uh, mentioned us on social media that they will be withdrawing that particular object. But in many other cases, we have not been able to do the same thing. It was just one-off case, right? There was some auction that was happening in Switzerland. There was some auction that was happening in UK, right? What would happen with those sort of cases? Like, we don't have plenty of information. For example, there was one particular object from Bhaktapur we are trying to repatriate from Switzerland, and that particular object, we had the before and after images, we have all the informations, but we were unable to file a FIR case. None of the government officials were able to write us a letter saying that it was stolen from that particular location in that particular date. So just that letter kind of stopped us from claiming that object. We heard that it was withdrawn later on, but we will not be able to take it any further than that, right? But in certain cases, we have to be a little bit clever as well. So for example, if you know the auction is coming to an end, and if you know that there's nothing you can do, we should just let it happen. The reason I'm telling you this is because if we try to stop it, or if we post the evidences in the social media, that means that particular object will never float back in the auction market again. It will disappear. But if we'll just let it be sold, it is very likely that that object will float back again in the auction after a few years. And that will be the right time for us to claim, right? So it's a very case-to-case thing. But yes, when urgent situation happens, we are very lucky with the Bonham situation, but every case is not going to be like that. There are so many challenges, and one of the main challenges is communicating with Department of Archaeology, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then connecting back to the the embassy in that particular country, and that takes time. So in urgent cases, yes, we try to communicate in that way, but usually it's impossible to do so.
Thank you for sharing that case. And this is mainly about murtis, right? The consecrated objects which was taken illegally from an active communal place of worship, and also to be returned to that very context. But what happens when the other object categories are in question, and what changes when the object in question was never communally owned or stems from a private Nepali household, or other kind of objects like secret objects or secular stone inscriptions or thankas. So let's try to look at these different other kinds of object and what happens in these things. So what happens when the object stems from a private Nepali household?
The first thing we need to establish is how old that particular object is, right? If that object is less than 100 years old, or if that object is, let's say, less than 70 years old, it is going to be very difficult to start escalating that process. I think it will not be possible to do that at all. But if you can establish that object is nearly 100 years old or more than 100 years, then we can, based on the Nepal government's legislation and laws, we can consider that particular object as a heritage cultural property, right? And based on that particular law, we should be able to claim these objects back to Nepal, because anything older than 100 years old or near about 100 years old, we should be able to claim it back because they are cultural properties. It doesn't really matter whether it belongs to an open space temple or stupa or in a private house. It doesn't really matter. But with the private collection, the problem is you struggle to find documents. You struggle to find the before and after images. How would you establish that fact, saying that it came from a private household? In some cases, yes, you can, because there are inscriptions, it may be manuscripts, right? And you will have those sort of information within that particular, let's say, the inscription plate or in a manuscript. You will be able to do so. If not, then it will be very, very difficult to identify. But when you say there's secret objects or objects that came from monuments, then I think if we have the facts, if we have the evidences which can prove that it is near about 100 years old or more than 100 years old, then you should be able to claim it. But having said that, I don't recall any particular case where we have directly dealt with an object that came from a private collection. Usually most of the objects that has gone out is actually from the open spaces, temples, stupas, and Baha'i and Bahis. Like those spaces are community spaces. And when you look at those secret objects that went from a closed room, usually you don't have any documentation. And in some cases there are documentation, like we are dealing with one of the object from Itumbal, which was broken into that secret room and was taken away. That is actually in the Manhattan court, which is they're trying to establish all the facts and figures, and if that matches, then it can come back to Nepal. But that is something we there was an image in the archive that matched with that particular image, and it was easier for us to claim it, right? So with private household objects, I think the most challenging part is the documentation. You don't find enough documentation to start that claim.
thank you. Fantastic. So I see a potential problem here with the private households. So private
Mhm.
obviously could also legally sell their own property, and this property could be older than 100 years. So where do we stand with that?
Yeah, that's a very challenging issue. That's a very, very challenging issue. When the government says anything older than 100 years old or near about 100 years old, you will not be able to sell it, whether it's a private collection or whether it's a cultural property from open spaces. That there is a clear legislation about that. They will consider that as a heritage and it should not be exported out of the country. There is a law, right? But the problem is, yes, what you have mentioned it's so right. It is being sold from a private household to international dealers or whoever are interested to buy these objects. Department of Archaeology, what we can actually do is, if you have any ancient object, or if you have any cultural property which is more than 100 years old, you can actually, they allow you to go to the Department of Archaeology and register that object. And if we do that, there is a possibility that we can claim. So if the local people can go and claim it because it's 100 and nearly 100 years old. But nobody, I don't think that Department of Archaeology has ever registered a private object in the as a heritage. It has never been done. you know so it's a very, very difficult situation. That why are the bahas and bahis are empty. You think about the people who are involved within that community. They, something has happened there. Those properties were within the closed doors. So that is a very, very difficult situation. I think the community, they are the safekeeper of these properties,
Mhm.
and they have to actually be responsible, if these objects are sold to anybody else. So I think in Nepal's case, it's very, very difficult situation. Like, I think we should be able to, if we feel that we have something which is considered as a cultural property, just for the safekeeping of that the object, we should actually go to the Department of Archaeology and record those objects, so that at least there are some chances that we can trace that particular object. But otherwise, I don't think there's any other way to kind of stop that.
Fantastic. And that covered very much the area of the secret objects too, where in this case, a priest could go to the department and have an object registered. Is that correct?
I think in that case, I wouldn't say the priest has to do that. I think the community needs to initiate this.
Mm.
Baha and Bahi is not run by one particular person. It belongs to the community, and there's so many people who are involved in the ritual that happens in Baha and Bahi, and similar kind of shrines and temples, right? So I think it has to be initiated by the community. For example, why you cannot go inside Pashupati and take pictures.
Yeah.
Why we cannot do that? It's a very difficult thing, right? If there is a documentation, then you can do something. But if there is no documentation, there's no hope at all. So I think that is something. I think we have to bring that awareness even within the priest and people who are actually running these, who are these temples and stupas and bahas and bahis. And I think they have to start thinking differently. I think if we have to start preserving our own heritage.
Thank you. So the next question we have is, what happens with objects that have not been venerated in a religious context, for example, ancient inscriptions, and they could now, if we repatriate them, end up on a busy car park or some kind of an intersection. So is repatriation into the original place of the object always a good idea?
If you think about a busy car park or intersection, I think it is not possible to kind of leave them there, right? Somebody has to rescue these objects, salvage this object, and take it to a safer place. When you see that the original space, original location is being destroyed, or there is no hope for it to be restored back into its original condition, then the first option is definitely to the museum. I don't think there is anywhere else we can take these objects. That they have to go back into a museum. And I think when you think about those sort of objects, yes, museum is the best place to keep it safe and talk about those culture, those objects, and that area in a completely different manner. But when you talk about objects that has been taken away from that particular monument, and if the monument still exists, the idea is to repatriate it back to its original plinth, right? And that is how we are looking at it. But if you think about the objects which are actually taken away from the roadside or a car park, I don't think these objects can go anywhere else. It cannot go back to another temple or a stupa, because when something is created and something is established in that particular location, there is always a reason. There is a donor who is involved. They may have carved that. You can talk about Ganesh or Shiva or Shivalinga. And they have donated that object in someone's name, someone they loved, someone in a memory of someone. Usually they create these gods and goddesses and donate it to the temple square or Chaitya square or in that sort of location. So if that faith is there, we will not be able to take those objects from one location and keep it somewhere else. So the only place I can think of is it can only go back to the museum. In certain, I had a conversation with few people, I think a couple of months back, when we were talking about the conquistatory Shiva, which was coming back from the Met Museum. And I was telling them, why can we not take that Shiva's statue and keep it in another Shiva mandir where they may not have a Shiva and they may have been just worshipping a stone? And that person who was a religiously attached person, he says like, no, you cannot do that, because these sort of objects are actually created and donated for particular purpose, or or it is dedicated to someone who has passed away. So there is no way you can take one deity from one location, one shrine to another. So if we have to respect that feeling, the only space would be a museum.
Is it similar when the object is of a different kind, perhaps an ancient thanka, which from a conservation and preservation point of view might do better in a controlled environment, which is away from exposure of light, which has effective pest control in place? So would it be similar for these kind of objects as well?
I see the thankas, and like anything which is made from organic material, I think they have a certain amount of life. There is no way you can expand its life. And when you look at thankas or pawas, they were like, when you think about some of the pawas, they're actually within a baha or bay space, and it was being taken out once a year or twice a year to do the worship, or they take it out usually in jatras or festivals and things like that, right? But when you look at it from the conservation point of view, like most of the older artworks which is done in the fabric, you have this layer of black smoke, and that is very normal if you think in that perspective. Obviously it is in a space where people worship every day. There's a priest who is involved in worshipping, and then there is also a community involved in worshipping, right? But the way I look at it is, there are two options. One, you can always create a reproduction and leave it for the community, but you cannot just decide it as a conservator or a historian. That has to be discussed with the community. You, as a conservator or a historian, you should be able to make them understand why that particular piece is so important and why we need to preserve it, right? And if they understand and if they agree to have the reproduction, that is brilliant. But the way I look at it is, things like this, all these ritual objects, ritual materials, ritual, deities, if they are created for a purpose, we should let that purpose to be fulfilled. We as a historian or a conservator, our duty is to, document about that particular object and keep that safe so that the future generation would be able to replicate that, if that is that is destroyed. So I think it's, conservation and preservation from the point of, if you look at it from the point of museum, archives, it's great. Those, we have to do that. I'm not saying that I'm against that. But when you look at some of the objects within the ritual spaces, within the temple or shrine, I think we just have to let that ritual happen, and we as a conservator, we're people who are involved into preservation, we can document that and keep it for the future generation so that it can get its continuity. If it's damaged, then the new generation will create something new, and that will be the part of the culture, and what normally happens is the authenticity is only maintained by that generation. The next generation wouldn't question that authenticity, whether it's a reproduction or a new one or old one. We, within our time frame, within our lifetime frame, I think we talk about authenticity. But when it is passed over to the next generation, I think that is the authentic object for them, and I think that is the beauty of a culture, of this living tradition. It has to be we have to keep on passing it from one generation to another. So, if those sort of objects, I think, we just need to let it die with dignity. I keep on saying this word, let it die with dignity. And that is the best way to see these objects.
Fantastic. But so for art historians, they would say we cannot repatriate a tanka because the object would die. Therefore, keep it, but we understand that there's a moral injustice done. Therefore, we can agree on a payment from Nepal.
Yeah, I don't think that should be the case. Like if you are the owner of the object, it should be returned back to the owner. It doesn't matter what that owner is intending to do with that particular object, and that is very important for museums to understand, and they need to look at how it arrived to their institution at the first place. And I think that is very important, because when you look at certain objects, it's a part of the community, it's a part of the people, and they cannot say that, they cannot disagree, or they cannot say that this object should not go back, it will be destroyed, or it will lose its life. I think that should not be the concern at all. The whole idea about, the repatriation of these objects is to give that continuity of that tangible and intangible heritage. And if we are not able to have those objects back, both of these traditions will be in risk. So I think, it should not really work in that way. I think it should be returned back to the original origin of that country, and they should not really worry about what will happen with that object. And I think this is the general question that we have been always being asked by institutions and auction houses. If you think about, Taleju Bhagwani necklace. Like the museum came back to us saying that why you want to claim this back after 26 years, 27 years. And it's none of their concern, because those days people have, Nepali people had different need. The country was going through a completely different need. The human rights was probably more important than heritage. Now this generation is more about it, more aware about the heritage, and we are actually, working to bring those heritage back. So I think these institutions should never think in that perspective.
Thank you so much for explaining these challenges in dealing with these different kinds of object categories. So, who are involved in the transfer of legal ownership from a museum or a private owner to a particular community in Nepal? And what role does Nepali government or Nepali embassies, Department of Archaeology, and the National Museums of Nepal play in this repatriation cases?
I think regarding the transfer of ownership, we as a campaigner, we are not entitled to make any of those decisions. We just bring the facts, we just make a claim, and then the rest of the things, all the paperwork, that needs to be done by the government, right? So the only organization that can transfer the ownership of these documents is Department of Archaeology. So when anything is transferred from another country to Nepal, it is actually coming back to the Department of Archaeology, right? So they are the first people first organization or the government department who will accept these objects from these international museums. But once they accept those objects, then they will decide where to send it. So, and usually it goes back to the Chhauni Museum, which is the national museum in Kathmandu, right? And that is the legal way of the transfer. But what is happening in recent days now is, like, once the objects are back, people are aware that these objects belong to their community or to a temple square nearby, and they want to have it back. They want to restitute these objects back to the original space. And in that case, the Department of Archaeology or the National Museum will hand it over to the community. I don't think that that can ever be handed back to one particular person. I don't think it will work in that way. So it will be handed back to the community, and they need to have that commitment that they will safeguard that object, within that location. And that is how most of the, many of the objects from the National Museum are being released back to the community, and which is a great thing. Like, there's so many things that we need to look after. Like, for example, there are security issues. Do we need security cameras? Do we need the priest to be liable about it? I don't think priest will ever do that, but I think it's back to the community. The community need to take that responsibility. So I think that ownership is always transferred from the international institution to the Nepali government, and the Nepali government will have that ownership, but they will store it in the museum, whether it's a patron museum or whether it's a national museum. But I don't think it will ever go back to a private owner. I have not seen that case. Like, most of these owners are, from a Guti. In that case, the Guti will accept it, But I don't think that it will ever go back to one particular person if that belongs to a person. If it is more than 100 years old, maybe the government will take. But I haven't seen any such cases, so I can't really comment about how that will be tackled.
Does the campaign also have other allies, like abroad through individuals or the Nepali diaspora organizations, international organizations, and governments? What kind of support has the campaign from different people?
We have the advisory board, and that advisory board have got different individuals from different background, and they are the people who support us all the time. I don't think that like like whenever there is an issue that we are not able to take care of, then we always contact them. For example, Emily Smith is there, Erin Thompson is there, Vijay Kumar from India is there, so Joylene is there. So there are lots of people who are involved in that process, and if we need any support from them, we'll always reach out to them. And they have got a different way to kind of take the case forward, because being in Nepal, there's so much limitation for us as a campaigner that we will not be able to even push a letter from Department of Archaeology to that particular embassy which is in that country. It's always difficult process. So what normally happens is, if we directly get in touch with one of our advisory committee member, they might be able to escalate that whole case in a completely different manner. So they're always there to help us, and similarly, there are other organizations. The Nepal Pride Project runs from US as well. If we need support, we can talk with them. If we need, there are other individuals in the diaspora community who are always emailing us saying that, okay, if you need any help in US, or if you need any help in France or UK, please contact us. So we have that connection if needed. So these are the people who are our assets, and these are the people whom we can completely rely when needed.
Thank you. Nepal has, by comparison, been very successful in repatriating objects from foreign owners and museums. Why do you think this is the case?
I think in Nepal's case, I think the repatriation story is very, very young. And it all started, to be honest with you, with the Lakshmi Narayan, right? And one of the reason I think the international community is talking about the Nepali heritage campaign is Nepali repatriation campaign is because we have the living tradition. These objects that are displayed in different museums around the world was fulfilling a purpose when it was in its own temple or a chaitya or that particular heritage area. And that is one of the reasons, because it's directly connected with the intangible heritage. If a deity is disappeared, if a main deity is disappeared from a temple, it will affect its other festivals and jatras and intangible culture, right? So we very much live in a living culture. Nepal is very much, Nepali tradition, Nepali heritage is very much closely connected with the living tradition. And I think that is one of the reasons Nepal is being talked about all around the world. And the other aspect I see is, I think the presence of lost arts of Nepal. This particular anonymous Facebook page has been so instrumental with the research work that has been happening in Nepal. This person is constantly working, constantly matching the objects from different museums around the world. And this is quite amazing. I think there's only few cases where people have been working in that way. So I think these are probably the two main factors why Nepal's case is actually being talked about all around the world. People, when people talk about the Nepal Heritage Recovery campaign, people cannot stop thinking about lost arts of Nepal. Whenever the Nepali repatriation story is talked about, there's two things we talk about: the living tradition of Nepal and the research work that is being done from the lost arts of Nepal. So I think these are the main factor. I feel that it is kind of driving that whole factor of repatriation campaign in Nepal.
Thank you so much. We've now come to the end of our conversation for today. But just before we go, I was wondering if there is one urgent thing that you would want to see change and that would make a huge difference, what would that be?
I think one of the change I would require is, like the repatriation would happen one way or the other. This process will not stop. So if I have to bring certain change within the whole, the repatriation campaign, I think the change what we need is we need to control our borders. We need to control how we can stop sending our heritage, exporting our heritage in the Western world. And that is, I think, which is required at the moment. If we can do that, the things can return, the objects can return, the deities can return. But we have to end it now. How would you do that? There's so many other factors that we have to deal with. So if you're asking what I want to see, I think the only thing I want to see at the moment is I want that theft to stop right now.
Thank you so much, Roshan, for joining us today. That was wonderful, and thank you so much for really sharing your experience and your insights on this very important issue. Thank you so much.
Commissioned music for this podcast has been produced by Vayu Audio Studios. Composer, music arrangement, guitar, tuna, sound mix and master, Vayu. Madal Dime Damaha and percussion, Kunal Singh. Bamboo flute, Anish Maharjan. Recorder, Jaco. Bass guitar, BK. Cello, Celso.